Hello! Today I'm going to review these Golden Open Acrylics. I've had these for many years and I have been meaning to do this review for a very long time. It's finally here, so let's get into it! Now, the Golden Opens are slow-drying acrylics, and as far as I know there are no other brands that do slow-drying ones. Let me know if you've seen any, because I've looked and I can't find any. But luckily for us, these Open Acrylics are high-quality artist-grade paints, and they include all sorts of information on the tubes, light fastness, tinting strength, pigment numbers, everything an artist needs to know. These ones are 59mm tubes, a bit bigger than the other acrylic set that I recently reviewed in the Golden Heavy Body acrylic range, which aren't slow drying. You can of course get those as 59mm tubes as well. But let's focus on the Open Acrylics today, and here are all of the colours I have. I've bought these individually over time, so you can see they have different lids, and that's because some of them are newer than others. The most expensive one is this Series 7 Quinacridone Magenta. That one costs an absolute fortune. This Naphthol Red wasn't that much cheaper at a Series 5. But most of the colours I have are Series 1, which are the cheapest in the range. Some 2s and 3s in there as well, I think. But you can see they've all got different lids. The round ones are the oldest ones, and the grey flower lids I think are the newest ones. I have one duplicate, and that is titanium white, mostly because I go through that one the quickest, although I still have heaps on the other tube as well. But at the moment I have 15 colours. I decided I'm going to squeeze them all into this little paint palette which holds 16 colours. I've used this one before for gouache and I have a video on that. It's an airtight palette, so it will keep paints wet for a long time, even though these slow drying ones stay wet anyway. Normally I'd just blob out some colour onto a flat palette like I would with oil paints, but I knew it was going to take ages to film this one, so I really wanted to keep them contained in a lidded palette. And I've organised them into colour groups just so that they make sense in the actual palette, because it's 4 per line. This is all the footage I got of putting paint into the palette, because somehow I completely forgot to record this. But I'm only putting in a small amount of paint, and I can always add more later if I need it. You can see the paints themselves have quite a thin consistency. They're definitely not heavy body, and here they all are organised neatly into this palette. It's not going to stay neat for very long though. I made such a mess of this over a couple of months, because that's how long it took me to do this video. I think I started in March, and then I've just been doing paintings while filming other videos as well. And this is due to their slow drying quality. I couldn't paint everything at once, I had to leave layers to dry, as we'll see in a little while. But I was just clipping the lid on to show you what it looks like. And here is my swatch page, which I've put in next to the Golden Heavy Body Acrylics. Now I'm just going to go through all of these colours and talk about them a bit. I filmed this part a few days later, so you'll see that the paints have not changed at all whatsoever in the palette, other than to get all over the inside of the lid. Yay! Let's get swatching! I'm just going to say that these are hands down the best acrylic paints that I've ever used. They have such a beautiful buttery consistency, and because they're slow drying, they spread across paper and other surfaces so easily. The colours are incredibly pure and vibrant. And I have a collection here of single pigments and other ones which are mixes. So some of them, like the first 3 here, are very, very translucent, and that's because of the nature of the pigment. And this Quinacridone Magenta is just the same, as is the Ultramarine Blue. Now I think about it, this first line has all of the single pigment colours, and they're just so wonderfully vibrant and pure colour. I love them so much. The next row has ones which have mixes. This Manganese Blue hue is probably the weakest in the set, just because it's a little bit lower tinting than some of the others. The teal, on the other hand, is incredibly opaque, and I love that colour so much. But they're just so easy to paint with. By comparison, when I was painting out the heavy body acrylics, they were drying almost immediately after hitting this watercolour paper, and it was so hard to spread them across the page. I was having to get a bit of water to mix it in, and it was making them really streaky, whereas these paints, I don't have to worry about that at all. They stay wet for ages, so I could just spread them onto the paper without worrying about adding water. I was rinsing and drying my brush in between each colour though, just so I didn't get any contamination. And overall, I'm really liking the palette that I've built up over time. Payne's Grey and Carbon Black are two that are kind of odd to have together. For the longest time I only had Payne's Grey, but Carbon Black was on sale and you can see it is actually much blacker, whereas the Payne's Grey is tending towards the blue side, so it's nice having both. Their titanium white is really great too. And here's all of the paints swatched out. You can see they're still very wet on the paper. It takes hours, if not a day or more, for these paints to dry, so there is a long drying time. Not as long as oil paints, so it's kind of a happy medium between oil paints and regular acrylics, which dry far too quickly for my liking. But I really need to demonstrate how these paints work in an actual painting. This is after a week or so and the paints are still perfectly fine, there's no change to them. I haven't sprayed in any water or anything like that. I just put that Airtight lid on and they're perfectly fine. Opening up my sketchbook, and in my previous video I did these flamingos. I really want to paint that flamingo onto a big canvas. Instead of using a coal erase pencil this time, I'm actually using a watercolour pencil, and it's in pink. This came out of that advent calendar I opened last year, and because I've drawn at this flamingo a few times, I was kind of familiar with it and it was a lot easier to draw it this time. I've just done a really basic outline, and now I'm going in with the background first, because I do find it easier to paint in a background and then I can paint the foreground over the top of it, rather than trying to paint the background in around the edges of the flamingo. Oh, that's so difficult to do. I decided to paint the background in various shades of blue and teal, creating a vignette effect around the flamingo. I was considering painting in leaves in the background, but then I just ended up not doing that. So it's just the blue, and then I'll have that contrasting pinky orange of the flamingo, which I think is quite nice. You'll see I have a small glass palette out, and I will use that in a while, but for the first layer of this background I was just throwing the colours on, and because they're slow drying I can just blend them easily on the canvas without worrying about them drying before I can get to them. I love that so much. They are the best paints, honestly. I cannot speak highly enough about these paints. If you don't like acrylic paints because they dry too quickly, I'm not much of a fan either because of that reason. These ones will change your mind. They are just so much nicer to use, and it is really like using an oil paint, but you don't have that messy cleanup because these just are water soluble like any other acrylic paint, and of course they're permanent once they're dry. Now I'm starting to use my glass palette to mix up some lighter pinks because my magenta is very dark, and I have a fairly limited colour palette overall, so I do need to spend time mixing. I don't have any purple, for example, so I always have to mix that with the magenta and blues. As I've mentioned before, golden paints are expensive, and so it does take a while to build up a collection. I'll link them in the description below. I think Amazon have some introductory sets of golden paints, so maybe I'll put that down there. But you can also buy them as individual tubes, and I've purchased all of mine at my local shop, the Art Shop in Melbourne. Now you may have noticed that I did nothing to the canvas. I didn't put any colours on it as an underpainting. You'll see a lot of artists do that. For example, painting the entire canvas with a light layer of burnt sienna or another dark colour like that to warm everything up. Now, I have a reason for not doing that on this particular painting, and that's because I wanted to show the colours in their purest form, and it's easiest to do that on a plain white background. If I'd started off with a toned canvas, it would have affected the colours a little bit, especially because a lot of my paints are quite transparent. It would have shown that coming through them, and I don't want this to be a warm painting. I want that background to be nice and cool, and I just didn't want any other colours affecting that underneath. So it's just entirely preference as to whether you put a background on first. Sometimes I do, but today I didn't feel like it. I just wanted to go straight on the white canvas, and I've done no preparation. This is a pre-gessoed canvas, and that's perfectly fine to use with acrylic paints like this. And really everything that I'm doing right now is the actual underpainting, because I'm going to go over all of this again in a while. But what I wanted to do is paint the entire canvas with all of the colours I'm intending to use, and you can see I'm having to mix everything up, so it's not going to be the same when I put the colours again over the top. but that's okay because this underlayer will show through a little bit. I've reached a point here where I need to let this whole canvas dry, and that's what I'm doing. I'm just clearing up my mess, putting the paints away, and I left this for a couple of days so this lower layer can fully dry, because after a while it becomes really difficult to layer paints on top of other wet paint. It's much easier to let it dry and then start again with another wet layer. And in my next session, I'm going to focus on painting in the background properly. Now, I'd run out of all of my blues in the square travel palette, so I'm just putting the colours straight out onto the glass palette because it's so much easier to use them from there. And this time I just wanted to make a nicer looking background. It's looking a bit boring at the moment. I wanted to add in some texture with the paintbrush and give it a more painterly quality. Also blending it a bit better so that the vignette is smoother rather than having a definite line which you can see in that underpainting. I decided I needed some white in there as well just to break up the teal because it is a very flat colour at the moment. And I spent quite a long time on this, but it was really fun to do and very therapeutic. Here's the actual reference photo I was using. This is from Pixabay, but mine is turning out very different because I completely changed the background. And this is based off my drawing that I did in the sketchbook from last week's video, because I coloured in a blue background and I just really liked the contrast of the peachy colours of the Flamingo, which are nice and warm, in comparison to that really cool blue background. I just wanted bright colours. And this was a good way to use quite a lot of the colours in the paint range that I have. It's not meant to be super realistic or anything, it's more a stylistic piece, and I just wanted something nice and bright with a cheerful look to it. I don't often paint on canvases, mainly because they take up a lot of storage space, but I think I'm actually going to give this one to a friend, the friend I mentioned before who really loves flamingos. I lost focus there for a while, so I'll just skip ahead a little bit. And as for the consistency of these paints, they have a very smooth, buttery quality, and they spread incredibly easily, but they don't have as much texture in them as a heavy body paint will. So if you're looking for a thick paint that's a bit drier and you want to spread it on with a palette knife or use a coarse bristle brush, then these open acrylics probably aren't going to be the paints that you want to use. So I would then recommend going for the heavy body ones. But these ones do still retain some texture, and if you want paints that act more like oil paints, then these are definitely the ones to go for. And they're an absolute pleasure to work with. I just love their smooth quality, and I can use any brush with them pretty much, including Taklon ones. I'm not rushing to blend the paints because they stay nice and wet and I can go over it again at my leisure. There's no smell to them. You can rinse the brushes off in water. And they're just so easy to use. They're very forgiving as well. If you make mistakes, you can just blend it in or go over them again once they're dry. Now I have actually let the background dry, which is why I'm resting my arm on the canvas. This is once again a few more days later, and now I'm focusing on the actual subject of the painting, the flamingo. My peach colours I mixed up using magenta, the naphthol red, and both of the yellows. And then I've done a partial mix onto the glass palette, but otherwise I'm mostly mixing still on the canvas itself. And now because I've done the background, I can paint over all of those messy edges with my foreground, and then the flamingo will stand out properly with nice line edges. As you can see, I'm just painting over those edges there. I was getting in a little bit of feathery detail a bit later on, but a flamingo's feathers are quite smooth anyway, so I didn't need to add in too much detail or feather texture. I'm really glad I spent the time sketching some flamingos in my book to begin with, because when I was planning this video I couldn't think of anything to paint, and by having a good sketching session I came up with some ideas for the painting in this video. I also have some other paintings, but this one took me so long and I ended up with a lot of footage, so I'm actually going to release a second part to this video in the middle of the week, so be sure to look out for that. I do have some other paintings that I did with the open acrylics, but I just wanted to focus on the flamingo today because this was the biggest painting I did of all of them. Now, if you have regular acrylic paints and you don't want to invest in the slow drying ones because they are pretty expensive, another alternative is to buy some slow drying acrylic medium, which you get in a bottle or a jar. You can then mix some of that into regular acrylics, like you'd put it on a palette and then mix it in, and that should hopefully slow down the drying time of any acrylic paint that you have. I've used it a little bit and it does kind of work, but I'm just not very confident with the slow drying medium. So I think in a future video I'm actually going to do a comparison of using these open acrylics along with some regular acrylics that I have slow drying medium for. And in my previous review of the heavy body acrylics by Golden, it actually came with a bottle of slow drying medium and I didn't end up using it with the paint, so I really want to actually try that out. I'd put the acrylics into a wet palette and that was a complete disaster. I also should mention that you do not want to put these open acrylics in a wet palette because it will destroy them. I've done it one time and it was a total mess. They can just be kept in an airtight container like the one that I'm using today, and I'll put that in the description below so you can find it. I got mine off Amazon and they're quite cheap. There's quite a few different ones around, so just do a bit of shopping and see which one suits you best. It was quite useful for this video because, like I said, it took me a long time to film this entire thing, plus the other paintings that you'll see in my next one. But really, these slow drying paints just work best on a glass palette, as you can see here. They stay wet for ages. It's just that it's a bit of a pain storing it if I want to paint over more than one day, because this paint will pretty much dry onto the palette within a day or so. Sometimes sooner, maybe a few hours if you're in a really dry or warm environment. I generally put out enough on the palette to get me through that particular painting session, and then I might put any leftover paint in a sketchbook or another canvas just so it doesn't get wasted, and then I'll wipe the glass palette off with a tissue or other rag and start afresh the next day. The great thing with a glass palette like this is if the paint does dry onto it, you can easily scrape it off with a palette knife or another metal object, so there's no problem there. I've just got a tiny one here. I do have a much larger glass palette and I highly recommend these as well. I'll see if I can find this little Redgrass one to put in the description. This is actually for painting miniatures, but they're so handy for my studio and for filming because it doesn't take up as much space. If you're doing small paintings, you don't really need a huge glass palette. Even with this large one, I only used a bit of it because, like I said, I'm still doing quite a lot of mixing on the canvas itself. But if I wanted to blob out the paints on the glass palette, then I'd go for a larger one. I'm starting to finish up the Flamingo, adding in a few of my favourite white highlights and adding in some more feather detail and texture, just to make it stand out from the canvas a little bit more. Like I said, it's not super realistic, it's more a stylized version of a Flamingo. I don't know why I'd put white dots on the background. I'm kind of regretting that. I should have just left well enough alone, but I went a little bit too far this time. And while it's still a bit wet here is the finished painting. Aside from the white dots, I'm actually really happy with how this turned out. I'm absolutely loving the colours. They mixed so well together. They're incredibly beautiful and high quality, and if I could only ever use one type of acrylic paint in the future, it would be the Golden Open Acrylics. I give them 10 out of 10. There is nothing I don't like about them. They are amazing paints. They're so beautiful. They work really well. They're easy to paint on. They're very forgiving, and they pretty much have all the qualities of oil paint with the ease of using an acrylic paint. The best of both worlds. I'd love to know in the comments if you've used open acrylics and what do you think of them. But here's what my painting looks like next to the sketch that I was actually using for my reference. And this is all I'm going to do in this video, but I have some more paintings coming out in the middle of the week because I still have heaps of paint left over. With quality paint, a little goes a long way. And here's the state of my palette now after I've actually done a whole bunch of other paintings. You can see I've used heaps of it, so be sure to come back on Tuesday or Wednesday to see the second part of this video and see what other paintings I did, including something in my sketchbook, an unfinished piece that I actually got finished. I'll go on then. I've got another sneak preview of one of the other paintings I did with a very bright yellow background. This one is pretty crazy. Here the painting's actually completely dry, and I spent some time going around the edges so all of the border is nicely covered with matching paints. And thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I hope that I was able to do the paints justice. And as always, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Please subscribe to see more of these videos, and I'll put a couple of other videos up here, eventually including part 2. Have a great day, and I'll see you really soon in the next one. Swatch you later. Bye!